Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past.
James Barr, author of several great books on the Middle East, including A Line in the Sand, which is about the way France and Britain shaped the map of the Middle East about 100 years ago. So we're here to talk about that colonial legacy, if you like. This Mandate era was a short but important period in the history of the Middle East between 1918 and 48. So if you could give us a brief background in the First World War, what shaped this mandate?
So at the beginning of the First World War, the Middle East was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it had been for 400 years, very nearly 400 years. The Ottomans took over what we now think of as Syria, Israel, Palestine in 1517, and they'd ruled it ever since. But at the beginning of the war, they then joined the German side against Britain and France. So they moved from being an ally of the British and the French through part of the 19th century to becoming an enemy. And that really mattered because it sparked a debate in London in particular about what would happen to the Ottoman Empire when the Ottomans lost the war. There was an assumption that they would lose. And Britain and France had a difficult alliance during the war because France had done most of the fighting at the beginning of the First World War. And Britain was preparing to launch a big offensive in 1916. Meanwhile, it decided it would try and knock the Ottomans out. So the question about what would happen to the Ottoman Empire became even more urgent because of this offensive that was going to happen. So the two sides met and they did a deal to cut the Ottoman Empire, or cut the Middle East between them in 1916.
And there was a commission in Britain that made the analysis that it might be in Britain's interest to preserve the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, right?
The commission was instructed to do this work secretly, and it had a range of different ideas. One of them was essentially to preserve the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire was divided up into provinces that had a local governor. And one view was to keep these provinces, to keep local governors, and to try to steer them. So to make them what people called a sphere of influence rather than a directly ruled empire, but that didn't happen in the end. In the end, what happened was a division of this part of the world.
And then you had this famous Sykes-Picot deal between Britain and France. What was the thinking behind that, and how did the map look as a result?
So the deal arose out of a very awkward French discovery, because in the background, Britain was also negotiating with the Arabs. And one man in particular, a man called Sharif Hussein, who was the ruler of Mecca at the time. And they deemed him to be important to winning over the much wider Arab world. And the French found out about that. And this was very awkward because the British hadn't told the French what they were up to behind the scenes. And when the French heard, they were angry, and they said, but we need our interests in the Middle East recognized. And there were people in France who said that this went all the way back to the Crusades, that they had been involved in the Crusades, they'd had this influence, and that still was the case. There were French schools, for example, in the Ottoman Empire. So France did have quite a strong cultural influence and some commercial influence, and they had invested in the Ottoman Empire. So the British realized they had to acknowledge that. And this is where Sykes and Picot came in, because Sykes, meanwhile, Mark Sykes, he was a young British politician. He wanted what he called a belt of English-controlled country across the Middle East. And the reason that he wanted that was that Britain was thinking about India. Britain saw the Middle East from the perspective of India, which was the most important part of the British Empire, the most valuable part of the British Empire. And they wanted to keep everybody else away from India. So the Middle East mattered because it was a land corridor towards India. So Sykes wanted his cordon. Picot wanted his interests recognised, and the two men got together just around Christmas 1915. And Sykes produced a map that he'd been involved in making before the war. It's a square map. It's about a metre by a metre. And he proposed, and this is his infamous phrase, he said, I should like to draw a line from the E in Acre, that's the final Crusader port that the Crusaders left in 1291, to the last K in Kirkuk, which is now part of the Kurdish territory in Iraq. So those were the words he used. So he was tracing his finger on the map as he described this to the British government. And the British cabinet had lots of other things to worry about, and many of them felt that it was an awkward problem. They knew it had the potential to sabotage their alliance with the French. So they said to Sykes, you go and do that deal. And so Sykes and Picot met, and they then marked the line on the map with coloured pencil and signed the bottom right-hand corner.
Mm. And what did that mean on the ground for the areas like Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria?
So the map draws a diagonal line across the Middle East, and the territory north of that line would go to the French, and the territory to the south to the British, but they couldn't agree on Palestine. So that was coloured in a yellow colour, and it was going to have an international administration. To deal with the fact that the British had already been promising things to the Arabs behind the scenes, there was an inland, a hinterland, where the Arabs were going to have some degree of autonomy. But the point was that the French and the British were going to control the coast. So any future Arab state was going to need British and French support to survive.
Mm. And there are a lot of what-ifs in this story. I mean, what if the Ottomans had gone the other way in the First World War? I think it was because of clever German diplomacy, for one thing, that they ended up in the losing camp. Would that have made for a sort of a more organic transition in the Middle East, a more peaceful Middle East, you think, had this map not been drawn in Paris and London?
The map creates an abrupt change. And the war creates an abrupt change because the Ottomans were on the German side. I mean, had the Ottomans had they stayed neutral, I suppose, and had in the way that Turkey stayed neutral in the Second World War, that might have changed things. But there was already a strong the development of an Arab national consciousness. Most Arabs, though, didn't necessarily want independence, but they wanted more autonomy and more recognition of their rights.
And Britain also encouraged this Arab unity up to a point, and there were different plans for an Arab League stretching all the way over the Fertile Crescent, if you like. That's another what if. I mean, if such an Arab entity had emerged as well, I guess.
That's exactly right, because the British saw the key interest in the Middle East for them was the Suez Canal, because Britain had taken over Egypt in 1882. It controlled the Suez Canal, and so the sea route towards the east, and it wanted to protect that. So after the First World War, at the point where they realised they needed to offer the Arab nationalists something better than they had, they started to come up with a plan that they called Greater Syria. And the idea was that by creating a unified Arab state or a federation of Arab states, perhaps the Arabs would be more willing to accept a Jewish presence in Palestine, and also perhaps the Arabs would act as a buffer zone protecting the British position on the Suez Canal.
Hmm. So this concept of the Middle East, if you go back further, it used to be the Near East. What do you make of the concept? How has it changed over time, the way we describe this region in Europe?
I think the British thought of the Near East, and what they were thinking of was everything from the most western part of the Ottoman Empire, which at that point included Greece and the Balkans. So the Near East early on involved places that we would now think of as European, but going east probably up to the frontier between what is now Iraq and Iran. That was the Near East. But they didn't really think about the Middle East. The Middle East was a concept invented by an American, Alfred Mahn, at the very beginning of the 20th century, and it became much more popular. But you find, in fact, I've seen a great map. There's a fantastic map which looks at the Middle East in a very different way. It's a map of the center of the Middle East now, so Iraq and Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and the northern Saudi Arabia. But it refers to it as the land of the 5 seas, referring to the seas around this area. So the Caspian, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and then the Gulf. And that's another, I think, good way of seeing it, because we often think about this part of the world as a kind of corridor for humans going right back to the beginning of, mankind. But also it's an obstacle for people who are seafarers, who want to take goods by the most easy, method, by sea, from east to west. Then the Middle East is something that's in the way of that. So I think that seeing it in those terms is also quite interesting.
And you've also written a book about T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, which is sort of the stuff of British legends, where he worked with this Arab revolt against the Ottomans. How important was that sort of sideshow in actual fact for the outcome of the First World War in the Middle East?
It doesn't make a huge difference to the outcome of the battles. I think the British, it was mostly a British force, would have defeated the Ottomans anyway. But the important thing that Lawrence did was to push the Arab revolt into the zone that Sykes had promised to François-Georges Picot in 1916. That was really crucial because Lawrence hated Mark Sykes. That's the important subplot. He thought that Sykes was an amateur and someone who should never have been given this job. And so when he found out about the map and the line drawn on it and knew where that line was, he was determined that the Arabs would cross into the French zone before the end of the war and establish themselves. And he then thought that the map would evaporate, that the map was no longer relevant because there were facts on the ground, there were Arabs in control. And that turned out to be wrong, because after the war, the British decided that of the promises they had made, the 3 contradictory promises they had made, they had to honour the one to the French and the one that they had made to the Zionists as well. Mm.
So I suppose Lawrence felt that the Arabs were betrayed by Britain in a way.
He felt they were betrayed afterwards. So he was a British imperialist like everyone else, and it's important not to overstate his pro-Arab views, I think. But he was sympathetic to the Arabs because he had worked with Arab archaeologists before the war. He'd been involved in archaeology in Syria, and he knew people and he understood some of their aspirations and how they thought.
And he saw promises being broken.
And he saw a promise. And that was very, very important for his personal security, because the British had made a grand promise to the Arabs, and that was the promise that he was repeating to the Arabs every day, that they would receive this state after the war. And so as a man on his own, often deep in the desert fighting a war, his own personal security relied on this promise. He knew that, if the Arabs had found out earlier that the promise had been betrayed, then his own life would have been at risk.
Mm. Some people seem to have realized that Sykes-Picot would be a recipe for future war in the region, not least the Americans, I think. And in hindsight, it seems very much out of sync with sort of the tendencies of the time, nationalism on the rise and so on. So kind of colonial wishful thinking, a bit too late, if you will.
It's exactly right, that it's an anachronism. It's out of date. It's the last of the scramble for Africa. So the 19th century division of Africa into these box-like areas in bits of the sort of Sahara. And this is sort of the final bit of that. And as soon as the Sykes-Picot Agreement was done, I think people began to regret that they had done it. So one of the interesting details on the map is that whilst François-Georges Picot signs his name in black ink, Mark Sykes uses a pencil. And it's perhaps just by chance, but I think that reflects the realization between the agreement of the deal and the finalization of the map and the signing of the map that this was already out of date, and it was a bit of an embarrassment. And when the Americans found out about it in 1917, President Wilson's advisor, a man called Colonel Howe, said, "It is all bad," and I told them so, because they could see that this paid no attention to the developing ideas that Wilson had helped to promote during the war, the idea of self-determination. This was not self-determination at all. It was European imperialism, the last gasp of European imperialism.
Yeah, and we can see the outcome every day on the news, basically. I mean, the Israel-Palestine conflict obviously has roots in the Mandate era, as well as turmoil in Lebanon and Syria. What do you make of the sort of responsibility of France and Britain in this context 100 years later?
There's no question that France and Britain bear a lot of responsibility for the origins of the conflict, but a lot has happened since then, and the conflict has changed over time and been Islamized in the case of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and we're thinking of Hamas. So it is, you can't explain everything through this, but certainly it's a really important part of the background to the story, and it's in many ways it's where this story starts. And I think the other important thing is that the phrase Sykes-Picot, which most people in Western Europe might have heard of, well, a few people might have heard of, very few people could say what it was, but the understanding of it, or the awareness of Sykes-Picot, is much, much greater in the Middle East. And there, in the Arab world, particularly amongst Arabs, Sykes-Picot it's a shorthand phrase that is that they use to explain their lack of agency and the fact that other people have made decisions that they then have to live with.
In a way, it's similar to the Crusades, that it emerges in different situations later on. I mean, the Crusades were not very prominent in the Muslim world for a long time, but then with the rise of colonialism and nationalism, they certainly came to the fore as well.
Because obviously sort of the interest in the Crusades revives in the 19th century, but then the French imperialists, who were not numerous, they were not a massive, they couldn't command massive public support, but they harked back to the Crusades. The Crusades was the part of the story that they told that explained why France deserved to return to the Middle East. And Henri Gouraud, who was the first French High Commissioner in Syria and Lebanon in 1920, he saw himself very much in those terms as a descendant of the Crusaders.
And during this Mandate era, there were lots of backstabbing between Britain and France as well, where Britain supported opposition against France in Syria and Lebanon, and in return, France supported Jewish insurgents in Palestine. How did that sort of dirty game play out, and were there any winners in it?
Well, I suppose, the real winners were the Zionists, who then created the State of Israel in 1948. They, through this, did manage to carve themselves a state that they had wanted since the 1880s. But the origins of all this start right after the First World War, and as you say, that the French and the British found it very, very difficult to live as neighbours in that part of the world, chiefly because they both faced great Arab anger at their presence, and each side tried to deflect the blame onto the other, or thought that their problems were being encouraged by the other side. So in 1920, the British faced a revolt in Iraq, and they felt that the French were somehow behind it. And then in 1925, an enormous uprising started in Syria. And the reason that was so toxic for Anglo-French relations was because the rebels hid on the British side of the Sykes-Picot line. So they based themselves in territory that the French felt was under British control, and therefore that the British should do something about that. But the British had no incentive to deal with the insurgency because they were terrified of a backlash themselves. They knew that if they handed over the insurgents to the French, they would face execution and there would be an uproar in Palestine. So they had no incentive to do that. They didn't at that point actively support the insurgency. That happened later in the 1940s when Britain starts to think about whether it can lever the French out of the Middle East altogether, whether they could create the Greater Syria that would appease the Arab nationalists. And when the French found out about that, they made a common cause with the Zionists. And the Zionists had been obviously fighting for a state of Palestine or agitating for a state in Palestine for a long time. Their campaign had by and large not been violent. It was a political campaign, but they were radicalized by the reports of what was going on in Eastern Europe. So the Holocaust, the news of the killings that the Nazis were responsible for in Eastern Europe radicalized the population of Palestine, the Jewish population. And from 1945, the British face an insurgency, which the French are supporting in two ways, really. They're supplying arms to the insurgents. But the other thing they're doing, which is probably more important, is that they were letting Jewish survivors of the Holocaust leave Europe through France and get on ships and go to Palestine. And that was very important. And the French resistance played a very important role in that because Jewish men and women had played a disproportionate role in the French resistance, because obviously as soon as they knew they were going to be rounded up, they fled into the hills and they joined the resistance. And those networks from the war were then used to get people and weapons down to the southern ports on the French southern coast and go to Palestine. And it was that showed that the British was the mandate in Palestine, the British mandate in Palestine, was essentially morally bankrupt because the British didn't know how to deal with these people for whom there was enormous worldwide public sympathy because of what had happened to them in the war.
Mm. And this sort of dirty game between Britain and France in the Middle East, was that inevitable given the construction of the mandate? I mean, it seems a bit paradoxical. Britain and France were fighting in Europe alongside each other in the First World War on the Western Front, while sort of undermining each other in the Middle East. Or was that just like a echo of colonialism, the same way it went on in Africa, for instance?
I think there's always been rivalry between Britain and France, and that's what makes this story familiar and yet also unfamiliar, because not many people know about how it shapes the Middle East. Was it inevitable? I think because they were neighbours and because they faced problems that they couldn't agree on a solution to, I think there was inevitably going to be friction. But it got worse during the Second World War, because the assumption that the British had made from the first was that the Anglo-French alliance was the most important thing. That was what governed the First World War decisions, and it governed the decision after the war to honour the promise to the French. But come the Second World War, because France had fallen, and because although de Gaulle was an important ally, he was also a great irritant to the British, relations then soured.
Still is, so I think.
It became harder and harder, and they ended up fighting each other.
Mm. And then during the Second World War, there were sort of a similar struggle in a way between Britain and the US, which is perhaps even less known, that you've also written the mind-boggling book about Lords of the Desert. I suppose that was mostly about oil at that point, so it was sort of a different motivation for it. But tell us about the basics of the US-British struggle.
It's not about oil initially. It's about American trade and the Americans wanting to get a foothold in the Middle East, which was not somewhere where the United States had much of a presence. The people who were there before 1940 were a few oil men in Saudi Arabia, but they had found very little oil, and they certainly hadn't managed to export it commercially. There were some missionaries, and there were a few archaeologists, and that was pretty much it. But the Americans wanted to break apart Britain's stranglehold on global trade. And one of the places they started was in Egypt, and they sent in people to try to break that open. But it then became about oil after the war, because the war had disrupted Saudi oil production. The Americans had got the rights to drill for oil in Saudi, but they wanted to export oil to the West. They wanted Saudi oil to help fuel European reconstruction, essentially. So they needed to build a pipeline from Saudi Arabia across the Middle East to the Mediterranean. And that's where the two sides then fell out, because Britain had this Greater Syria concept, this idea that there would be a ring of states, a ring of friendly Arab states east of Suez, but the Americans wanted to build their pipeline directly through that. And the Americans realized that what the British were doing was not in their own interest. So they did everything they could to upset the British plan and to break it apart by showing the different people who the British were hoping could be reconciled with each other what was going on and playing them off against each other. And so that collapsed. The British grand plan disintegrated, and the Americans built what was called the tap line, and Saudi oil started flowing to Europe.
Mm. And Churchill and Roosevelt has been perceived as being very much in tandem during the Second World War. But it was quite a different story in the Middle East then, as you tell in your book.
It was. I mean, it was very awkward. As you say, publicly they had to look like they were getting on, but Churchill felt that he was being pushed by Roosevelt to agree to liberalize trade for an end of empire after the war. And also at one point, Churchill thought that Roosevelt wouldn't be president for much longer, and that there was this other man, Wendell Willkie, who had stood in 1940 and looked like he might be the coming man. So Churchill was very keen to make friends with him. And there's a terrible moment for Churchill where he tried to phone up Willkie. When Churchill went to the United States, he goes on holiday there during the war to have a rest, and he tried to ring up Willkie, but ended up being put through to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt realized what was going on and didn't like that either. So there's this a sort of personal clash going on, I suppose.
Yeah, and you have a fascinating chapter about this Willkie character. It's a bit the same as with Sykes and Picot. I mean, the importance of personalities and connections and coincidences, really. How much would you attribute it to sort of inevitable structural forces, and how important were these personalities? And
I think the personalities were really important. There was the people that both Britain and France were ruling were not happy at being ruled by Britain and France. But Willkie himself is a very interesting character, because he wanted a platform. He wanted to continue during the 1940s, having lost the 1940 presidential election. He wished to stay in the public eye, and Roosevelt offered him this chance to go on a global tour to promote American values, and really to answer the big question of, what are we fighting for? What are we fighting this war for? And what kind of post-war world can we look forward to? And he felt that Willkie could do that very well. And Willkie made this trip, and he went to Egypt, and he went to Palestine and to Syria. And he spent very little time in each of these places, but long enough that it gave him a confidence about talking about what he felt that the wrongs that there were, and the fact that British and French imperialism were well past their sell-by date. That gave him this power. And he came back and made a broadcast to the American people on his return, which made swinging criticisms of America's allies, and it was listened to by millions and millions of American people. So that set a tone, I think, and it made people in the United States much more aware of the Middle East.
Yeah. And this rivalry between the US and Britain in the Middle East, for a long time during the Cold War and these wars against Iraq, Britain sort of put a lid on that history. And now with this transatlantic rift that we see opening up under Donald Trump, do you hear any echoes of this old story in the newsfeed?
I think what you see now is in a way it's a more extreme version of something that's always been going on. There is a perception that the Anglo-American relationship is very, very strong. In Britain, people refer to the special relationship. But in fact, America has more than one special relationship. And the problem for the British government is that it has based its entire foreign policy on saying there's a special relationship.
And the nuclear deterrent.
And the nuclear deterrent.
And intelligence and so on.
All this stuff. So what the British are trying to say is come to talk to us because we can talk to the Americans. But the problem is that when you start looking into the actual history, you see that the relationship is much, much more one-sided than the British claim, and it's much, much more tense than the British like to claim. And that's partly why a lot of the records that are about this relationship are still secret, years after they should have been declassified.
Fascinating. We have to stop there. Time's up. But thank you so much, James Barr.
Thank you for having me.